Good afternoon, everybody. This is the second video with regard to fabbing up the throttle body intake elbow. Originally, I was going to make a work in process video and show you sort of how I fabricated this part, or started fabricating this part up. Turned out this was a pretty convoluted process, so instead we're going to start with the finished product, or close to finished product, and then a little later in the video I'll work backwards and I'll show you some of the techniques I used to be able to fab up and get the shape that we're talking about. It's actually pretty complicated with various size diameter tubes and different angles, and candidly this is probably something better left for like computer-aided design instead of the approach I took. But in any event, it's for the most part almost complete. So I figured some people would appreciate, walking through some of the details. But just as a recap, the reason I'm fabbing this up is that there's just no room for the throttle body on the LT4 in this rear engine Superlite chassis. I originally planned to shift the engine back 1.5 inches, and I thought I would have enough room to use the silicone Cobra head elbow, which is more compact than a standard elbow, but it turned out I did not have enough room. So then I figured, okay, well, let me fab up something that I would make out of aluminum so I can see what it would look like in the car and see if it would fit. And this was the prototype piece. I always like to build a prototype piece, and I made this out of some plywood to get the shape, and some swimming pool noodles, some duct tape, and a little light aluminum tubing from Home Depot. And I was able to bolt this on the car and make sure it fit, so forth. And then the hard part was to actually fab this up out of aluminum. Now the reason I'm using aluminum is I can't simply use a silicone elbow behind the throttle body. There's too much vacuum or negative air pressure, and this elbow, according to the manufacturer, cannot withstand that amount of vacuum. So I have to make it out of something rigid. So this thing, in my opinion, it came out great. It's not the most beautiful item in the world, but I think it will do the trick, which is, I have about 3 inches from the throttle body intake to that rear firewall. And this simply bolts up to the front of that engine and then bolts up to the throttle body, and it'll do the job. Now, what I'll do in a minute is segue over to how I made this piece, but if you look at some of the angles, we have this sort of Cobra head shape out of aluminum. The sides are made out of 2 1/4 inch tubing. Then we have a flat aluminum back. And then we have the 4-inch tube that gets connected to this flange. It's a Holley LT or LS throttle body flange. I had to put this on the mill and mill it out a little bit so it would fit this 4-inch tube. Then I had to shape this 4-inch tube, which is not that complex, but this particular piece is very complex, which is it has to wrap around the side of this Cobra head that's coming out on an angle, and then also the back portion of this is pretty complicated as well. And I also wanted this tube to come in at an 18-degree angle, so it sort of keeps this flange away from the firewall so I can mount the throttle body. So these are just very complex shapes, and it was really difficult to get this right, but it is ready for welding up. All I have to do is cut this area out and cut that area, and then I can give it to the welder. I won't do that until I get a few more things for the welder to work on, and then I'll give him a bunch of things to do. Okay, so I'm going to segue over to how I was able to fabricate this part. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the process of making this thing up. It started off simple and then it got exponentially more complicated, but essentially what I did was I bought two 120-degree mandrel bent aluminum tubes from Ferocious Motorsports. They've got a really nice selection of mandrel bent tubes, and they're reasonably priced, and they're down in Delaware, and I live in Jersey, so the shipping is very reasonable. But I basically bought two of these instead of a single 180-degree elbow because the bend on the 120 is tighter. I forget exactly what the bend is, the radius was, but it was tight enough to get something very similar to the Cobra head. So basically what I did was I had the tube and I had a block and I have a little caliper, and I like using this machine die, and just sort of ran the pipe around, got a nice crisp line. Then I just used a hand jigsaw with a 24 tooth blade, and it cuts the aluminum like butter. It's very nice. So I was able to fab up these very quickly. You know, I had to adjust the cut exactly where I wanted it to get that Cobra head shape, but that was pretty easy. Then once I got the shape, then I simply just had a flat piece of aluminum, used more of the blue dye. You know, I put the shell on here and used the scribe and had a nice crisp line, and then also used a hand jigsaw and cut that out and just fitted it. And then the next thing I needed to do was to put this adapter on. Now this adapter is a little longer than it needs to be. I'm going to take it down about 1/4 inch, but it needs to be on a certain angle. It needs to be on about an 18-degree angle. So I cut it straight and I laid it on top of this, and then I also used the blue dye and the caliper and just traced the tube, and I got a nice crisp line and cut it out. So everything was moving along quite quickly until I got to this tube. And think about it, I mean, you have a tube that's expanding at a certain angle, then you have a tube coming in at 18 degrees, and then you have to mate up the bottom of the tube that's 4-inch diameter with two half circles that are 2 1/4 inch, not diagonal, but diameter. Okay, so it is complicated, and I figured I would do this with a pattern, but making a pattern wasn't all that straightforward, but I'll show you how I did it. And this is working backwards. So this is the final pattern that I came up with, and you know, one side is this blue tape. I literally wrapped the tape around the the fixture that I was machining up, and then I used some construction paper just so that I can handle it. You know, I get a nice crisp line. I fold it in half, and you can see by the time I got done making this pattern, it's actually pretty darn close to the final product. But it took a long time to get it to this point. You know, and you can look at this tube. I mean, you just can't simply take a rigid tube without, you know, some sort of computer-aided help and figure out these complex angles. But ultimately, I was able to build this pattern, so I'll save this just in case I have to remake this. You know, I hope I don't have to. But anyway, so this basically led up. This was the predecessor. So because this is so complicated, I knew I couldn't build this out of a single tube. So what I decided to do is break the shape down in 2 parts. So one would be this back half, and then the other part would be the front half that is angled around this way and then angled into the comb. So I made this first, and then I made this second. So I attached this to the fixture, and then I cut this. And when you cut something like this out of a 4-inch tube, it literally expands because the extruded aluminum is under pressure. So I had to actually rebend this into the right circumference. But the net is this is what I used to create this pattern. So I was able to machine this separately than this, and then I taped them together and then made the pattern out of it, and it came out pretty good. It just took a long time for my brain to process how to go about doing this. And before before we got to this point, this was the original pattern. I simply cut it out of this soft aluminum, mounted it on here, used some painter's tape to get the shape, and then I test fitted it, and then I used this as a guide to cut this, and then shaped these independent, then wrapped it in this final pattern, which worked out perfectly. And all in all, I'm sort of thinking this was 25 hours worth of work, even longer. It was a tremendous amount of work. But anyway, I think it came out great. I'm going to quickly segue over and I'll show you what this looks like now in the car. All right, here we go. So this is what the elbow looks like in the car. As I mentioned before, I'm going to trim this piece about 1/4 inch because I need to make more room between the elbow body and the firewall. I've got some aluminum firewall and some sound deadening that has to go in there, so I need a little bit more room. But I'm also going to route it, I think, under the frame. The first video I showed routing it over the frame, but I think the 4-inch tube will interfere with the body. And I think this will be good too because there won't be any bends. So essentially the throttle body will go here, the mass airflow sensor here, and then the air filter out here. So this is what it's going to look like. I actually have the throttle body here. I'm going to try to position it and show you what it'll look like. Sort of hard to hold the camera and do this at the same time, but let's see how it comes out. There we go. All right, so that's what it's going to look like. So the next, let me just take this off. So anyway, the next thing I'm going to tackle is the rear engine mounts. And once I send the rear engine mounts to the welder, I'll send this to the welder. And then and the engine mounts should be pretty straightforward. And then the last thing with regard to getting the engine in the car is the alternator mount. So that'll be the last item I'll have to fab up. Then I'll probably do a summary, so we'll talk about what it took, how many hours it took to do all this custom work. Clearly, if you're not up to doing all this custom work, you simply get the standard engine that fits right in the car. You don't have to go through this, but to me, this is going to be worth it. After that, we'll start working on the steering. The car is designed for manual steering. I'm going to put power steering in it, so I've got a little custom work there. But we'll see how it goes, okay? So thanks for watching. Take care. Bye.